What do you make of the results today in the midst of these global economic shifts and what's happening in the Chinese economy more specifically?
Well, I think the results were great. I mean, again, the company's growing at more than 50% at the top line. There's obviously been a lot of concern about trade wars. That's had a pretty significant sentiment effect on the stocks. The e-commerce sector, as represented by EMQQ, is down close to 35%. From its early in the year highs to its lows this week or last week. But if you put it in perspective, again, I mean, 54% top line growth is incredible. I mean, there are very few companies in the world of any size that wouldn't feel quite good about growing at 50+%. I know that they've lowered the estimates for revenue for the full year, but if you put it in perspective, I think that things are still quite strong. And I think what Joe said on the conference call this morning was really how I would look at it. And the three things were, you've got 300 million middle-class Chinese consumers now. That number is expected to grow to 850 million in 12 years. So 150% rise in the middle.
They don't have debt like Americans do.
Yes. And so secondly, what he touched on were sort of financial services more broadly. I mean, he touched on debt and the ability for the Chinese consumer to lever themselves up. But it's also, Alibaba is competing with all industries in China. And because so much of the economy is state-owned, the state-owned banks, for example, are susceptible to losing to newly digital customers, and Alipay, obviously an example of that. And then the final thing that he said, which really ties all three of these together, is the digitization of their entire economy. And the one number that I thought was most intriguing in the reports was the Hema markets.
Hema supermarkets, which is part of their big bet on physical
online to offline.
Online
that's right.
Retail,
And I was in Hangzhou 6 weeks ago and had lunch at a Hema market, and it's the one thing I saw on my most recent trip that just it's hard to explain to people.
It's a very unique experience. I was going to ask you to sort of paint the picture for us.
Well, it's like Whole Foods on meets the Jetsons. I mean, there's tracks along the ceiling, and elevators lifting bags up to go through a hole to get on a scooter and deliver it in 30 minutes. And the number that was to me most striking was that, and it's still a small part of the business, but 60% of their orders were online. So I don't know what the Whole Foods percentage is here in the U.S. for online ordering, but I'm sure it's not even 6%, if it's even 1%. So I don't think people quite understand the leapfrogging that's going on as these entire economies become digitized, because they never had bank accounts and a lot of the things we take for granted.
That said, as you point out, Alibaba is so huge, it spans industries. There's not, really any other player that can take it on directly as a competitor. Is it truly unhitched from the economy, unhitched from the future of the global economy and the Chinese economy, or is it even more hitched because it is so large?
Well, I think it's certainly hitched to the economy, but this is a secular change, right? Things are, in our worlds, we see this, whether it's Netflix versus traditional television, whether it's Google versus the newspaper. We've seen how these things have changed our world, but in the developing world, in emerging markets in China, that traditional consumption infrastructure doesn't really exist. And so you take this giant consumer wave, 9% retail sales growth for the country, but it's going onto the smartphone. Because most of the retail infrastructure that the malls that we have and so forth don't really exist there. So I think Joe is right that really the entire Chinese consumption economy, online, offline. In fact, they even said that they're dropping the word "e" from commerce because it's all the same thing to the Chinese consumer.